There are certain games that are doing things very differently to everything else. Games that, due to a number of contributing factors in their design, all coming together in just the right way, all end up having a really special quality to them. And when one of these games happens to click with you, it can make for quite the experience. Now in this video, I'll be talking about a much smaller, lesser known game than the ones in these clips. But despite this, it still possessed this special quality to me, and bloody hell did I ever click with it. And I suppose I should actually introduce myself, that would be a start, wouldn't it? So hiya, my name's Ryan and welcome to the channel. Thanks a lot for clicking on the video, and hopefully it doesn't end up being the worst thing you watch today. So the game I'm going to be talking about is called Northern Journey, and I'm going to try to show you what I think makes it as special as I think it is, mention a couple of things I wasn't personally too hot on, because let's be honest, no one's perfect, and I suppose my overall main reason for making this video is because I truly believe that more people should know about it and give it a shot. And so my hope is that this leads to at least a few more people discovering it. And just to note, there will be spoilers in here as I'll be jumping around to various parts of the game, and a few of the sections I'll be showing off are probably more effective and enjoyable when you're not expecting them. So if you are liking the look of it, please feel free to leave this video and never think about it again. Go and check the game out for yourself. I can promise you now before I even get going that it'll be worth your time. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's get into it. So how I found out about this game was on Twitter. I was scrolling away as we do and something caught my eye. A game developer called Dylan Rogers was tweeting pictures out about the game. Now this guy posts a lot of insightful stuff about game development and cool looking games in general, and he's worth following just for that really. And he's also making his own game called Gloomwood, which is shaping up to be something pretty special in its own right too. And I really like the look of the pictures that he was tweeting out about this game, but what intrigued me more was what he was saying about it. He described it as a fascinating mix of miasmata, pathologic and Soulsian shortcuts wrapped up in a Norwegian woodland fantasy. Now personally, I wasn't sure what miasmata was, as I'd never heard of that one, but I certainly knew what pathologic and the Souls games were because I love both of these games, and I'm usually on the lookout for games that are similar to them, so I was quite surprised that I'd never heard of Northern Journey when it looked and sounded exactly like my kind of thing. And it turns out the game was made by one person in the spare time while they worked a part-time job, so that's probably why I hadn't heard of it, because there wasn't really any marketing around it. And it's also the developer's first game that they've made as well, which is a point I think that will become more impressive the more you see of the game. And so from these tweets, I wanted to know more about it, so I went to YouTube to find a trailer or some gameplay, and the following clip is what I was met with.
Welcome, my child. We will now read the genesis of the game Northern Journey.
Now I've got to be honest, I was a bit thrown off by what I was seeing. You've got your man here calling himself a space priest and he's kissing a book. What's going on? But you know, to be fair to him, my interest was very much piqued. And the video goes on like this for about 8 minutes, and he talks about how and why he made the game, and there's gameplay interspersed between him talking, and it's sort of like a devlog. But it's a good watch and I highly recommend going and checking that out. And I actually found this video really endearing, and I was on board with the guy's eccentric vibe. There was just something really honest and funny about it. And so because of this, I've been convinced that I had to go and check this game out for myself. So off I went to Steam to pick it up. So what even is this game I'm banging on about? What is Northern Journey? And well, it's kind of a whole lot actually. Simply put, it's an FPS action-adventure game. It's single player only, and while there are some more open areas to it, it's mostly linear. And the majority of the time, it's got a much more slower, methodical pace to it than a traditional FPS does. And there's more of an emphasis on the feeling of exploration and discovery. It's got a really weird and intriguing story running through it, and this serves to push the player forwards through each area. And I also found it to just be really entertaining and surprising as well. And I wouldn't call it straight up horror or anything, but it can certainly get a bit creepy and absurd at times, which might freak some players out. But I can't see this being too much of an issue because most of the time it's pretty chill and light-hearted. And even in these creepier moments, there's always a sense that the developer is just having a bit of fun with it and wants you to also be enjoying the nonsense that you're likely witnessing. And the game is also doing a whole load of interesting things when it comes to its gameplay variety, enemy encounters and environmental design. And there's a couple of key things about it that make it feel really unique and special and set it apart from a lot of other games. But before I get into that, let's first check out how the game opens. So at the start of the game, you find yourself on a boat. The player character remarks that they are completely lost, and then all of a sudden you start getting shot and your boat starts sinking. And because you're unable to swim, you're forced to row to shore. And then it cuts to you on the shore looking at your boat sinking, which is a pretty sorry state of affairs, let's be honest. And the character says, "What do I do now?" And then you're given control, and then off you go up the nearby hill. And as you're continuing upwards, you eventually run into this weirdo, the flute player, who's a key character in the game's story. And to look back on this part now, actually, this is sort of an early warning sign that things are going to be a bit amiss in this game. Just the way this character looks and what he's saying, there's just something off about it. And after you've finished talking to him, he says, "Go on, continue up the hill. There's a town up there, and don't forget to check your journal on the way up because you look a bit dim." So you've been playing the game for all of 5 minutes at this point, and you're already being insulted. Brilliant. And because we are indeed dim, we check the journal, and we can see there's a few objectives in there that the flute player's given us. And then we continue upwards to the town, which is called Deadwell. And really, that name doesn't exactly bode well, does it? So you proceed into the town, and it's here that the game really starts to show its hand. And I'm telling you now, in every corner of Deadwell, there's some sort of nonsense going on. So let's take a little tour of the place. And unfortunately, the first person we run into is the village idiot. Now check this guy out. He's prancing about half-dressed, and he's going on about his pet worm. Upon closer inspection, that doesn't look like much of a worm to me, but what do I know? Swiftly moving on. A little ways further into the town, we have the tax evader and the sheriff's son. And I really like this little animation here where the kid's picking the berries and spitting them at him. And across the way from that carry on, we have the sheriff himself and the woman in the prison. Now I say woman, but I mean look at her. Nothing out of the ordinary going on here, clearly. Anyway, on the opposite side of the town, there's the local church, and you might be thinking it's just a church, whatever could be the matter, but don't be fooled. This church is more occult in nature than anything else, and as soon as you walk in, it's just really unsettling. There's scratches from under the floorboards, weird noises and that, then the priest walks in and he looks like an alien or something. It's just best to vacate the place as soon as possible. And then finally, towards the back of the town, you've got the witch's house, and I really do appreciate how ugly these character models are, especially the older witch. Look at the state of her. It's so bad. The things they say as well are pretty funny. They're trying to come across as not being witches, and it's just all a bit daft. And so yeah, that concludes the tour of Deadwell, and personally I think it's a really strong introduction to the game's world, and it's really doing a lot with a little. You're mysteriously shipwrecked in this unknown land, you meet this strange character who leads you up to this even stranger town, and the town itself isn't all that big, but it's bursting with weird, oddball, quirky characters that are all saying or doing really strange and intriguing things that you can't really make head nor tails of to start with, but you kind of want to know what it's all about, or at least I did anyway. And looking back on it now, it really brings into focus what the game's all about. It's sort of explicitly saying, this game is weird. If you stick with it, you're going to have a pretty crazy and out of the ordinary experience. And this had to be one of the most bizarre openings to a game that I'd ever come across, and I just instantly wanted to know, what the hell is the crack with this game? What's going on here? And so as we start to leave Deadwell and start to get into the gameplay, I first want to take a brief look into the game's development. And I want to do that at this point because I think it will give a bit of a better idea as to why the game looks, sounds and plays the way it does. So the main area of development that I want to take a look at is the process that the developer came up with called the Holistic Game Development approach. And I want to focus on this specifically because I think it affected every aspect of the game in some way. And what it basically entailed was the developer coming up with a way to create the game that he found both sustainable and enjoyable. And he shows off what he means by this in that devlog. He shows himself going out on expeditions into nature in order to get assets for the game. And because he lives in Norway, he's a Norwegian developer, Northern Journey I suppose the clue's in the name there, he was able to pop out into his surrounding local area and find things that he liked the look of and take samples of them to put into his game. And this whole approach extended beyond simply gathering assets too. He also used it to gather sound effects, and he even included various activities that he enjoys that appear throughout the game as unique game mechanics. And this was one of those things that really stood out to me when I first watched that trailer. It was so cool to see someone doing this kind of thing to assist them in creating a game, and it's like there's actually a little bit of Norway in it, which is just awesome to me. And then to think about it from a development standpoint, it's also a really efficient and smart way of working. It's letting them save time because they're not having to create everything from scratch. And really, it sort of just makes a whole lot of sense to set the game in a Norwegian inspired land when the place is literally the developer's back garden. And I'm sure he employed lots of other methods to create the game. I mean, anyone creating a game of this scale on their own must have a crazy amount of skill and drive to see it through. too, but what I think the holistic game development approach in particular ended up leading to was a uniquely tailor-made looking and feeling game that's bursting with its quirky personality. And to me, it's this personality that bleeds into every facet of the game, from its graphics to its gameplay, and it gives the whole thing a real special quality that makes it stand out compared to a lot of other games. And to focus on the graphics and the way the game looks for a minute, here's some clips of a few different places that you go to. So I really like the way the game looks, and the quality of its graphics and art style are quite understated to me. Now I'm sure that to many people it's not what would be considered technically good graphics necessarily, whatever that actually means, and it might not be doing numbers in its polygon count or out like that, but when you take into account that this is someone's first go at doing this type of thing, not only is it impressive, but there's obviously been a whole lot of effort put into determining the way the game should look, and there's a lot of skill on display in giving each area a distinct feel while remaining visually unique and interesting to look at. The forests are thick with trees and foliage, caves are dark and claustrophobic, marshlands are covered in a thick fog, and the more mountainous areas appear vast with an impressive scope and scale to them. And there's a lot more to these places than what I just mentioned, but what I'm getting at is that the developer really nails each aspect of the environment. Each place just sort of looks and feels right while having this air of mystery to them, and it's all portrayed in this really cool aesthetic. And it was just one of those things where the more I played it, the more I started to notice the extra little details and touches here and there all throughout the game. And everything from the way it looks, to how each area is laid out, and to how all the assets, items, characters and enemies are placed within them have real purpose and thought behind them. And all of this comes together and layers upon each other to create not only a really cool looking game, but also this fantastic and thick atmosphere. And it's this atmosphere and how it differs from one place to the next that's really one of the things the game excels at. It's able to expertly convey different moods depending on what the developer is wanting the player to be feeling at any specific time. And another big part of what helps to consistently achieve this, beyond just the visuals, is the soundtrack. Each part of the game has its own distinct music and sound, and the developer has actually said that he would first create the area and get the look of a place down, and then he'd use an image of this place to look at while he created the music for it, which would help him to find a sound that really fit each area and convey the mood he was going for. And I found that this absolutely worked and helped to tie all the other elements of a place together to really sell the intended atmosphere at any one specific time. And the soundtrack itself deserves very special mention, to be honest, because there's just something utterly brilliant about it. It goes from being haunting to hypnotic to straight up energetic and crazy sounding, and I don't really fully know how to describe it honestly, but it always enhanced the overall experience. I've never really heard anything like it, but it's just quality. Have a listen to some of this. So with that out of the way, now let's start to have a look at the gameplay. So going back to where I left off in Deadwell earlier, after you finish looking around that crazy place, your journal updates and leads you to the next area. And on your way there you're told you have to get hold of a weapon. So you make your way to get hold of that, and as with most things in Northern Journey, it's far from the traditional FPS style starting weapon. So you know, it's not a pistol or a weak shotgun or anything like that, no, it's a rock sling of all things. And while this might initially seem pretty unconventional as far as starting weapons go, there's actually something quite brilliant about it. It's a weapon that's stays viable all the way through the game since it's got unlimited ammo due to there always being rocks about. And when it comes to using the thing, instead of simply pointing and shooting, you have to actually line up and judge each shot, and there's a bit more skill involved with it. And it's always dead satisfying when you manage to nail a distant or fast moving target. And the other cool thing about all this is that this satisfaction is not exclusive to just the rock sling. Because most of the weapons in the game are actually projectile based, what you start to find is there's actually a really natural feeling of improving and getting better with each weapon the more time you spend using them. And you start to figure out what each one's strengths and weaknesses are and how to best utilise them in every situation. And so what are we throwing stuff at in this game? Well, to find out, let's have a look at the first enemy encounter. So as you've probably gathered from clips throughout the video so far, the majority of enemies are insects. And I'm talking, these are some of the most horrifically animated, creepy crawlies that I've ever seen in a game. There's just something about the way they move and attack that makes my skin crawl, and the way they're used in certain places is straight up panic-inducing nightmare fuel. And I'm not even messing around when I say that either. You know when you have one of those bad dreams where like bugs are falling on you, or you're covered in insects? Is that just me? I don't know. Well, anyway, there's parts of the game that somehow manage to feel like that. And I'm not even trying to say this is a negative thing. If anything, it goes to show how well designed the enemies and environments are in order to have this kind of effect on me. And at the end of the day, I suppose you do want insects to be creepy and freak the player out like that. You know what I mean? If an insect was the size of a dog or something, you're not going to want to go over and give it a stroke, are you? You'd be losing your mind at the sight of such an abomination. And aside from looking hideous, they do thankfully make for really interesting targets to ping rocks and other projectiles at. And there's actually a really cool interplay going on between these types of projectile-based weapons versus the erratic movements of the insects, and it results in there being this sense of urgency in the back and forth of the combat, and there's just this intensity to it all which wouldn't otherwise be there. And this is another one of those things that makes the game stand out. There's not many games with this type of weapon being used specifically against this type of enemy. And there's also an impressive amount of enemies as well, and they all have unique attack patterns and animations, and we can have a look at a few more of these now. So there's all kinds of pests in here. We've got big spiders, small spiders, underwater spiders, flying spiders, jumping spiders. There's a lot of spiders. It's probably not a game you'll want to play if you're an arachnophobe, though I suppose it could definitely be used as a form of overcoming this fear, let me tell you. There's also bees, dragonflies, mosquitoes, daddy longlegs, loads of flying insects to be honest. There's a high chance your favourite one will be in there in some shape or form. There's also woodlice, centipedes, leeches, and to finally mix it up a little bit, there's goats, snakes, bears, and oh yeah, a moose. So it's not exclusively insects, but it's got to be like 90% of the enemies that are. And as previously mentioned, each specific enemy type has their own attack patterns and movement styles, which makes them fun to fight and engage with. And there's a couple of particular instances that I want to get into now, where the enemies are used in tandem with the environmental design in some really clever ways to create some memorable and frankly horrific encounters. And first up is this place. So after a few hours of playing the game, you arrive at this swampy marshland, and the first thing that draws the eye are the flying insects. However, there's something else lurking here that you don't notice straight away. And if we take a look at the long grass, there. And it's because of these little gits that I'm mainly showing this area. And to look at them, you know, I suppose you could say they're just small spiders, what's the problem? But these things are such a pain to deal with, it made the whole area put me on edge. So these work like this. If you're looking at them dead on, then they don't move. Now if you start to turn left and right and get them at the edge of your screen, or in your peripheral vision let's say, then they start to slowly creep the way towards you through the grass. And if you find yourself in the unfortunate position when you've got your back to them, then they must be flipping, sprinting straight towards you or something. That's what it felt like anyway. There were times where I'd felt certain, you know, I'd checked and double checked, no spiders about, let's go. But no, they would always get me, like almost without fail, and it was always horrible because it made me jump every time it happened. And there's a combination of a few things going on here that's working against the player. You've got the spiders being hard to see because they blend in well with the tall grass, so you're being put on edge a little bit because you're looking for them coming towards you at all times, and you can get a little bit paranoid because you're like, did I see a spider just then? Yeah? No? Maybe? Only for it to get you the next second. And while you're focusing on this, you then start getting attacked by the flying insects that are buzzing about, which forces you to look up and start dealing with them. And because you're now looking away from the ground, any spiders that you were keeping still, whether you could see them in the grass or not, are now crawling towards you. And to top it off, this is all taking place at the edge of a lake, and it is quite easy to get a little bit disorientated when keeping track of two different enemy types like this. You know, you're doing a lot of quick looking around and backing up while making sure nothing's sneaking up on you, and you can end up in the water if you're not careful, which is an instant death, so not really ideal. But this wasn't something that ever happened to me personally. Oh no, not at all. So you can begin to sort of see how things can quite quickly get out of hand here, and it never really allows you to get comfortable. And even on subsequent playthroughs, I would always make a mad dash through this place and get out as fast as I could. Seriously, screw those bloody spiders. Right, so we're somehow going from bad to worse now. A bit further into the game, you find yourself in this area which is called Sourwood. Now this place is pretty unpleasant as it is. It's pretty gloomy and miserable looking, and there's some right horrible enemies knocking about. And the one that I want to talk about is the absolute worst of them all. Right, so what it is, after you've explored Sourwood a bit, you come to this big zip line. And it's a bit innocuous looking, it's just a big zip line. You've used them before quite a bit up to this point. And on my first time playing the game, you know, I jumped on it, thinking not much of it, and I just so happened to look below me. And I noticed that in the trees were these little red objects, and I did wonder for a moment what these might be, but I didn't really think on it any more than that. It was just some asset or object stuck in the trees that I was able to see from up here, moving on. So I proceeded to get off the zip line and start moving through this forested area. And then all of a sudden, I heard this rustling of leaves as if something was falling down through the trees, and then a thud. And I turned to see what the noise was, and what I saw was this horrible thing. And so what had happened was this big blood-sucking tick had fallen out of the trees above me and was now scampering towards me. Horrifying. And before I had any real time to react to what was happening, it was on me. And if it manages to get you, it attaches itself to you and you cannot escape this animation. It stays hooked to you right there on the screen, right in your face, until it's finished sucking your blood and taking your health. And when it does eventually get off you, that's when you can kill it. And honestly, the first time this happened to me, it was panic-inducing. It really got to me. I don't know what anyone else thinks that's played this section, but I was not a fan. And after I'd composed myself, I started to think about what just happened, and I realised that the tick was red and it had fallen out of the trees above me. And that's when it dawned on me. Sat in all the trees in this area were those ticks waiting to detect me below and drop onto me. And that's when I decided to make the rational decision and quit the game and never play it again. Thanks a lot for watching this video. Don't forget no, I'm joking. What I actually tried to do was second guess the game, because I'd clocked them sitting in the trees on the way down. I thought to myself, maybe I can also see them in the trees from below and safely attack them from a distance. And if that is actually possible, I'll be able to avoid triggering them from dropping on me, letting me avoid that horrific ordeal from before. But things are never that simple, and as I looked up, I realised there was a problem, in that the trees had red leaves on them, and it was pretty much the same colour that the ticks were. But it was at least possible to take the ticks out from a distance, it was just kind of hard to find them. So at this point I was pretty happy with this system. I was picking them off at a distance and making slow but, you know, sort of steady progress into the forest without any of them dropping on me. But this was pretty short-lived because I'd failed to notice something else. Now unfortunately for me, I hadn't realised that at the base of the trees there were also tick eggs, and I'd totally missed this because I was only looking in the trees for them. So you can guess what happens next, can't you? I was so preoccupied with looking up, I didn't hear any thud, I didn't see any tick falling out of the tree, just a weird sound that was probably it hatching, and the next second it was just on me again, right in my face, right on the screen, and I shit me pants. Then it just descended into chaos. I was running around thinking, where the hell has this come from? Ticks start falling out of the trees every which way. I'm like, oh no, no, no. The tick finally gets off me, and because I don't manage to kill it in time due to the panic, I then realise that once they've taken your blood and are all fat, they actually explode if you don't kill them in a certain amount of time into multiple other ticks that then come after you. And when I said it before, you know, nightmare fuel, this is it. And I'm willing to put money on this being the desired effect that the developer was going for with this section and the previous part with the spiders, and they both got me really good. And beyond just giving me a heart attack, the game is able to cleverly mix its environmental and enemy design to create some truly memorable and intense moments like these. And there's a lot more in there as well. These were just two examples, and they're not all as intense and unnerving as these ones either. Another great thing that the game has going on is that in many of the locations there are these unique encounters and mechanics that are only really used once and then never again. And these all help to mix up the gameplay variety and keep things feeling fresh as you make your way through it. And there's a couple of these that I want to highlight, and the first one takes place in this area called Nokkpond. And you arrive here quite early on in the game and you start to realise that something's not quite right. As you approach the pond, you start to hear this eerie, high-pitched noise, and before you know it, your character's being slowly drawn towards the water. And this is happening without any input from yourself. They're doing it of their own accord, and it's like, what's the crack here? And the gist is that the pond is home to a creature called the Nokkpond, and in Folklore, this thing creates a sound that leads adults and children to the water's edge, where it then pulls them in and drowns them, which is just delightful, isn't it? But from a gameplay point of view, this is actually really interesting because your controls are actively working against you, and the closer you are to the water's edge, the stronger the pull of the Nokkpond is. So you're having to deal with the enemies that are around the pond while constantly fighting off being slowly drawn towards it too. And not helping the matter is that dotted around the water's edge are health and ammo, which are all there to entice you to venture that little bit closer, which then increases your chances of being pulled in. And that is just really devious design, it's quality. And I've actually got an additional little tidbit of information here that I came across when I was looking into the game, and it's that the design of the Nokkpond and the actual artwork for the game's front cover on Steam is inspired by a piece of artwork by a Norwegian artist called Theodor Kittelsen, who drew the Nokkpond between 1887 and 1892. Cheers Wikipedia. Then next up we're looking at this dingy place which is called Trollhole, and yeah, this place is about as nice as its name suggests, and it's basically a big underground cave system and it goes down a real long way, and the lower down you go the worse it gets, and you start coming across stuff that wouldn't be out of place in a Lovecraft story or something. And speaking of which, when you get to the lowest levels of the cavern you come across this thing called the Guardian, and what this monstrosity is a big writhing mass of tentacles that lives in a subterranean lake, and you need to get past it. And there's a few stages to this. At first you don't have a weapon that can hurt it, so all you can really do is look for an opening and quickly scoot past. And then once you finally do get past, the layout of the cave changes a bit and the window for running past is tighter, so you can't really make it anymore. But fortunately you find a bait bag, and this is stage 2. And you can use the bait to lure the Guardian away. You can throw a bit to the other side of the cave, the Guardian will go for it and you can make a run for it. But you've only got a few seconds before it comes back to get you, so you need to keep an eye on where it is and be ready to throw more. And you rinse and repeat this until you get through. And then you come across a dead body with a note and a weapon next to it, and the note says that if you use this repeating crossbow to attack the Guardian in quick succession, it will retreat underwater, which will give you a brief opportunity to run past. So this is stage 3. You shoot the hell out of it so it goes under, you get a move on when it's safe, and it will come back up again, so you need to keep an eye out and then shoot it when it does, and you continue to do this until you're out. And what stood out to me about this section in the game in particular is that it introduces a couple of new mechanics in pretty quick succession, and the player goes from feeling pretty powerless at first to then empowered in the space of about 5 to 10 minutes. And then none of these mechanics are ever really used again either, it's only specific to this part of the game. And much like with the Nokkpond section from before, the brilliant thing about these encounters is that it's the developer drawing from what he knows and pulling these creepy and mysterious creatures from Folklore in order to make these really cool gameplay scenarios that fit perfectly with the overall theme of the game, and none of them ever overstay the welcome. And when the game isn't throwing unique mechanics or encounters at you, it more often than not has really nicely made environments for you to explore, which leads me into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is the level design. So this place is called Greenslit, and I'm showing this area off here because the layout of it is pretty special. It's one of the game's bigger locations, and it was one of those places where when I first arrived here, I was like, no way has one person been able to create all this, what is going on? The size and scope of it is proper impressive, and it's got a real sense of verticality, with loads of different winding paths that lead all around it, and it's probably my overall favourite area in the game, and this is in no small part to it being pretty reminiscent in certain ways of something you'd find in a Souls game. It's a really interconnected area and you're able to get to a load of different places from it. It leads back to Deadwell at the start of the game, you can get to Trollhole, Nokkpond and a handful of other areas too, and it does that quality thing that all the great Souls-likes manage to pull off, where you end up looping around on yourself but you're not always aware that it's happening, and all of a sudden you'll be back at an area where you started, or you'll come up on the other side of one of those does not open from this side doors that are pretty synonymous with Souls games at this point. And there's other types of shortcuts such as dropping ladders down or lowering bridges, and these are something that feature all over the game to assist you with traversal when you're returning to a previously explored location. And beyond the Souls-like stuff, I just really enjoyed being in Greenslit and exploring it, and I think the key reason for this was because no matter what path I would take, it would always lead me to something worthwhile or interesting. be it some impressive vista overlooking where I'd just travelled from, an item I needed for a puzzle, spotting a hidden path tucked just out of view which contained a health or item upgrade, or coming across one of the many unique enemy encounters that are dotted around the place. The sense of exploration that it offers is just really well done, and really this is how many of the locations end up feeling for the most part, Greenslit being the most impressive to me due to the sheer size and complexity of it. Most of the places are well thought out and are enjoyable to explore and knock about in, and again it's sort of incredible this is this fella's first go at doing this, and I suppose the fact that it is one person and it is their singular sort of vision, which probably helps to keep things feeling as consistent as they do, even when it goes a bit out there and gets pretty daft on occasion. And as it goes on, you're taken to more fantastical and surreal locations, but nothing ever feels too out of place. The environments lead into each other in a way that does sort of make sense, or at least as much sense as this game's crazy world and logic allows for, I suppose. And it's this through line of everything feeling connected and laid out in the way it does that ultimately culminates in the game successfully being able to make you feel like you're actually going on some big crazy adventure or journey, I suppose you could say. And the developer has actually mentioned that one of the games he was inspired by was Skyrim, and specifically the parts where you're walking around between quests and just exploring the world. And really I think one of the biggest draws of open world games in general is that feeling of immersion they can offer, of being lost in a huge world and being able to go off in any direction you choose. And you sort of just can't really beat that feeling of naturally coming across something interesting or unexpected that you feel as though you've found yourself. And personally, I feel like they're at the best when you're not looking at a cluttered map full of icons or ticking off a big to-do list, and you're able to just freely explore at your own pace. Now the kicker to all this is, Northern Journey isn't an open world game. You do occasionally go back to previous areas, and you have the option from time to time to travel back and forth between a couple of places, but you're not free to just go anywhere, and it's a very much more directed, linear experience. See that mountain over there? You likely can't go there, and it doesn't really matter, because despite the facts, it's still able to evoke a similar feeling or experience to games that are much bigger than itself. And one of the ways it achieves this is how it reveals its world. It does it in quite an unusual way, where the map isn't filled in until you've arrived at a new place, so you're never quite sure how many locations there are or how much of the game's left. Another thing is that there are quite a few gameplay sequences that lead to some really surprising places and encounters that you don't see coming, and some areas had much more to them than I was initially expecting. And that's a key thing really. In general, the game has just got a lot more to it than I think most people would expect going in, with it being an indie game with a small budget made entirely by one person. And in a weird sort of way, I think this ends up working in the game's favour, because people's expectations are probably already pretty tempered going in, and I reckon most people will get more than they bargained for with it and be pretty pleasantly surprised. This was my experience anyway. And because it's not a massive open world 50 to 100 hour game, this actually makes it instantly better, doesn't it? Because games are too long now, aren't they? Now, all joking aside, what I mean is that, you know, it's not stuffed with optional missions, side content, or an overabundance of collectibles that can be used to pad these longer games out, and sometimes to the detriment. And because of this, it ends up respecting the player's time, delivering a more focused and worthwhile experience, while also managing to feel much bigger than it necessarily is. And this is to me the game's biggest overall strength. It's able to deliver this brilliant sense of adventure where you can just sort of get lost in the enjoyment of exploring these cool and crazy looking environments, and underpinning it all is this feeling of there always being something more to discover, some unexpected encounter or gameplay mechanic just around the next corner, and there usually is. Now, as much as I think Northern Journey is a banger and could happily spend probably a few hours talking about all the things I think it does well, there are a couple of things I personally had a problem with that I feel are worth mentioning. So first up, and probably what is my main gripe with the game overall, are the boss fights. And my frustration with these stems from the fact that so much of what the game is trying to do, it manages to execute so well and with real confidence, that the boss fights just sort of stick out as being the weaker parts of the experience. There's just something aimless or a bit directionless feeling about some of them. So the way a few of the bosses go down is like this. There'll be a big arena, usually at the end of an area, health and ammo is strewn about all over the place, and the boss will be there flailing around trying to attack you. And the fights pretty much all devolve into you doing laps around the arena to collect the health and ammo when you need it, while slowly chipping away at the boss's health until they die. And many of them move and attack in a really unpredictable way, and they're not easy to read at all. So this results in there being no real strategy to attacking or avoiding them, and this just compounds the issue for me. And And to top it off, they also feel a little bit bullet spongy too, which is probably the reason why there is health and ammo all over the place. And yeah, you know, this just ended up making many of the fights feel a bit lackluster and underwhelming. Now on a more positive note, this thankfully wasn't the case for every boss in the game. There were the odd ones that were pretty well done, and these tended to be the smaller, mid-area sort of bosses, or the more gimmicky ones where you'd need a specific item or weapon to kill them. I found these didn't really bother me like the bigger end of area bosses did, and they tended to be a bit more engaging and fun to fight. And one final thing to note about the bosses is that while I wasn't a massive fan of fighting a lot of them, I did like the way many of them looked. There's some really creatively designed ones in it, and a few of the fights in particular had an impressive spectacle to them, which was pretty cool to see. So the other thing that caused me some issues was this one particular section of the game where you're underwater, and it's in an area called Drowned Veins, and the gist of this place is that you have to find your way around this dimly lit underwater cave while finding a few items that are placed around it in order to progress. So you get a little bit of guidance with these red ropes, or maybe veins I suppose, and you're supposed to follow these. However, because it's quite hard to see with being underwater in this dark cave, it all ended up looking a bit too similar to me, and I found it pretty easy to get turned around and lose track of which direction I was going in. And there was a point where I ended up back in the same place a few times, and I was just like, come on man. And I suppose in a way this isn't strictly all on the game. It's likely one of those areas that differs from player to player, and I'm sure many players probably aren't stupid like me and coasted right on through this bit with no problems. And here's a funny thing, because this video has taken me so long to make, the developer actually updated the game a few months ago and addressed this specific issue I had with this area. And the patch notes state that they've removed 2 of the items that you previously had to find, which results in less backtracking and lowers the chance of getting lost like I did. So it's been significantly streamlined. So I suppose this section of the game doesn't have an issue anymore, but I still wanted to mention it since it caused me some problems when I first played it. And this probably ended up being addressed because the developer is really active in the Steam discussions, and I've noticed him responding to any questions or issues that people have. And he seems to update the game accordingly if he can fix them or thinks the suggested changes will positively affect the game. And this is just really great to see. It shows the developer cares and he's looking for ways to actively improve his game. Now, one other thing I suppose I could mention, though this isn't really a problem with the game, it's more the way we've been conditioned to play games nowadays, is that the game doesn't have any auto-saving. So hypothetically speaking, you could play a large chunk of the game and then forget to save, then stupidly die and lose a big bit of progress. Now this of course never happened to me, no, not at all. But you know, I thought it was worth noting that it's good to remember a quick save every 10 to 15 minutes or so in order to not unwittingly lose an hour or more of your life, because that, I imagine, would be pretty bloody frustrating. So outside of the bosses and the issues with Drowned Veins, that is no longer an issue at all really, I actually didn't have any other notable problems with the game. There just isn't a lot wrong with it in my opinion, and on the technical side of things, I've never experienced any glitches or crashes, and I've been through it almost 4 times now. And the game also appears to be really well optimised, and I bet you'd be able to run it on a variety of modern machines at whatever resolution or FPS you'd like. But in all honesty, I really don't know too much about this sort of stuff, so maybe take this with a pinch of salt. You know, Digital Foundry, I ain't. And one final thing I wanted to note that's a bit of a nice surprise is that the game runs really well on the SteamDeck. I had to do a little bit of faffing around setting up the controls, but this took all of 2 minutes to get sorted and then I was away. I had myself a little portable version of the game, and there was absolutely nothing stopping me from running out into the fields or forests while playing the game to really get the proper Northern Journey experience. What a beast. So ultimately, Northern Journey shattered all my expectations for what an indie game of this nature can be. I was consistently surprised by pretty much everything it was doing, and I had such a brilliant time with it from beginning to end. And the more time I spent playing and thinking about it, the more I was taken aback by the fact that this was all made by one person and it was their first go at making a game. And I guess this is probably a factor as to why it turned out as good as it did in a sense. This guy just wanted to make a cool game, and there was no bigger team or publisher or anything trying to advise against any of his ideas or ask them to change something about it. So it resulted in it being this proper unique, uncompromised game, and considering how good at least I think it is fairly unknown. Now I'm not expecting it to gain mass appeal through this video route, I mean you can see my subscriber count, but I was so impressed by it, it actually inspired me to have a crack at making a video like this about it, in the hope someone maybe comes across it and likes a look at the game. I just feel it deserves more people talking about it, I guess. To me, it's the very definition of a hidden gem, and it's got all the hallmarks of an indie be darling too. I think if the right people were to get their hands on it, or if it was to be covered by a bigger channel or game site, I could see it easily blowing up. And it's just one of those games where the more time you give it, the more you start to realise you're playing something pretty special. And while the weirder side of how it looks and plays might not be for everyone, even with the couple of things that are a little rough around the edges like the bosses, there's just something so brilliant and unique about the whole thing, and there's really no doubt, in my mind anyway, that the actual game itself is excellent and more than worth your time and money. Especially so as it's a tenner, which is absurdly cheap for what you're getting. And I am really glad to know that I'm not alone in this thinking, because currently on Steam, the reviews are sat at 97% overwhelmingly positive. So it looks as though everyone who is lucky enough to come across the game and give it a fair shake seem to be having a similarly great time with it. And honestly, I'm not surprised in the slightest by this statistic, because what a game it is. And that's all from me at this point. I think I got across everything I wanted to say. If anyone stuck it out and is still here listening to me wittering on, good on you, and thanks for checking out the video, it really means a lot. I'm hoping you found it somewhat entertaining or informative, and if you do end up checking out Northern Journey, or if you've already played it before, leave a comment below and let me know what you think about it. I've got a few ideas bouncing around on what game I'll make a video about next, so I'm hoping I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!